Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we thank you for joining us for this episode. A topic that fascinates and, to be honest, frightens me is that of near-death experiences, or NDEs. The people who have had these powerful experiences are like explorers returning from an unknown land, as they have uniquely straddled the thin veil between life and death and have returned to tell the tale. While only 17% of those who nearly die report an NDE, there is a striking similarity between the accounts of those who do. We have all heard of outer body experiences, tunnels of light, seeing loved ones who have passed on, and in some cases, even being given the choice whether or not to return to this earthly life. Each of these kinds of experiences could easily take up an entire episode, which we may do in the future. For this episode, though, I would like to focus on the other commonly reported occurrence during NDEs, which is seeing your life flash before your eyes. As recently reported in The Guardian, when Greg Nome, a 24-year-old, slipped into the churn beneath a waterfall and began to drown, his body pummeled against the sandy riverbed. What he saw there surprised him. Suddenly, his vision was filled with crystal clear scenes from his childhood, events he had mostly forgotten, and then moments from early adulthood. The memories, if that's what they were vivid and crisp. Was he reliving them? Not quite. They came at a high speed, almost all at once, in a wave, and yet he could process each one individually. One particularly striking account I remember spoke of standing in a beautiful and lush meadow, as the highlights of life were lovingly projected onto an invisible screen in the air, as if at a magical drive-in that played the story of your life. Now, a groundbreaking paper in the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience has shown that brain signals can continue 30 seconds after the heart stops beating, and that the brainwave patterns leading up to and following death are similar to those associated with memory and dreaming. Has science proved that our life does flash before us as we transition from life to death? We will discuss this captivating research and what it means with Dr. Kate Einarson, who works in the Research Institute at Holland Bloorville Kids Rehabilitation Hospital in Toronto, Ontario. A behavioral scientist by training, she holds a PhD from the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Behavior at McMaster University and a Knowledge Translation Certificate from the University of Toronto. But before we get to that, a big thank you to everyone who joined our Dead of Winter virtual haunted campfire series over the past few months. We had a great time and got to hear so many wonderful local storytellers from around the world share their favorite creepy tales. If you missed any or haven't tried one yet, the recordings are available on our website. From this series, I would highly recommend Creepy Fairy Tales with Dale Jarvis about the rather nasty fairy folk of Newfoundland. If you're into politics, our Washington, D.C. campfire would be a great choice, as there are so many ghosts and spirits lurking in those famous buildings. And also, I have to recommend our Edinburgh, Scotland campfire, as who doesn't love a storyteller in a kilt? I would encourage you to check out our full list of campfires at hauntedwalk.com. We have resumed our in-person ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, and if you live in or will be visiting those cities this spring or summer, we hope you will include us in your plans. We would love to share some great ghost stories with you. We also have several other awesome projects and events in development that I know you will want to hear about, so be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, for the latest news and updates. Two really easy and helpful ways you can let us know you are out there and enjoying the show is to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen, and to recommend Haunted Talks to friends, family, random strangers on the internet, or anyone you think would enjoy it. Dr. Kate Einarson, welcome to Haunted Talks.
Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you here to discuss and break down new research that was published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience entitled Enhanced Interplay of Neuronal Coherence and Coupling in the Dying Human Brain. Quite a mouthful. It carefully examines the brain activity of an 87-year-old epilepsy patient in Vancouver during the transition from life to death. The findings may explain the similarity in reports by those who have had near-death experiences, or NDEs. In particular, the concept of seeing your life flash before your eyes as you pass on. Perhaps, Kate, the best place for us to start is to talk about EEGs. As the study indicates, this is the first time this diagnostic tool has been used to observe the moment of death. So what is an EEG, and why has it never been used in this way before?
That's a great question, Jim. I think what people have to understand about this study when we start our conversation is that it essentially comes from a scientific accident. So nobody set out to do this research. It was happenstance over the course of treating someone. And you touched on the arc of this. I'll just explore it a little more. So it was a study here in Canada, in Vancouver. An elderly man had a fall and a head injury. So it didn't start out as an epilepsy study, but the fellow experienced a brain bleed and had surgery to relieve the bleeding on his brain. He was fine for a few days, and then he started having seizures. So EEG, which you mentioned, is something we're going to dig into today. And EEG is commonly used to assess seizures. So all of this data gathering was happening because the man started having seizures after the surgery for the bleeding on his brain. It's pretty common to use it in that sense. The things that happened afterwards were the unexpected part.
And what precisely is the EEG measuring then? What's it kind of looking at, if you can explain it to us in kind of simple terms?
Sure. An EEG is an electroencephalogram. So it's measuring electrical activity in your brain, tiny firings from the cells on the surface of your brain. And it's a great method to use for a lot of things because you can do it non-invasively. So if you've ever, for example, been to a sleep clinic and had your brainwaves measured in a sleep clinic, the electrodes or the net that they put on your head, that's an EEG. Pretty different from something like an MRI, where you, I described once to a friend, get laid onto a sort of fast food tray and slid into a giant machine the size of an entire room. That's expensive, time-consuming, noisy. Did I mention expensive? So EEG is sort of a trade-off, a different way of measuring your brain activity.
I have done a sleep study myself, so I have had the experience of having all the electrodes hooked up, and it has a very sci-fi kind of feel to the whole thing. It wasn't easy to sleep either, I gotta say. But just to pick up on something you've already mentioned, just to segue briefly, You mentioned how what we're about to talk about was an accident. How often in scientific research, study, knowledge, do helpful accidents occur?
Accidents or helpful accidents? Accidents happen, I think, all the time because science is such an exploratory process and you're always pushing the limits of what we know and what we don't. That's how you discover new things. This I would sort of hesitate to call a happy accident because, of course, it has a really tragic ending for the fellow in question who's provided us with this fascinating data for the first time. But again, as the authors of this paper point out themselves, there would have been no other way to get this information. So the accident is a really remarkable scientific opportunity for them and for the community.
Well, let's not hold the suspense any longer here. What did the EEG reveal as this gentleman made the transition from life to death?
Right. So the EEG monitor was running to measure the seizures that we've already mentioned. And what happened that was unexpected is that the gentleman went into cardiac arrest. So he had a heart attack. And the team didn't realize at the time the implications of the fact that he was hooked up to the brain imaging equipment at the time. But he had a do not resuscitate order. So instead of interfering and ripping off all of the equipment to engage in life-saving measures, they let him be as per his wishes, and then realized that they had, by their own description, about 900 seconds of recorded brain activity from before and after his transition from life to death, including the time when his heart stopped beating. So I think before we talk about what they found, we might have to do a high-level description of some brain measuring terminology, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's dive into the brain.
Okay. So let's talk a bit about brain oscillations or brain waves. These are patterns of rhythmic activity that we see in everybody's living human brains, but we separate them apart and label them to help describe what's going on. So, unfortunately for our listeners, these are named after Greek letters of the alphabet. So, some of us are more familiar with them than we might have been a year or two ago. These are labels we also use for COVID variants. But we're talking about brain waves. So, if we're talking, for example, about beta waves, those are the types of waves you see in a brain that's awake and alert. Alpha waves are also when you're awake, but maybe when you're quiet and contemplative and resting. Theta waves are the slowest, and they can occur when you're sleeping or when you're really relaxed, like when you're meditating. And delta waves are a deep, dreamless sleep type of wave. So they're low and they're slow. But separate from all of those, we've got the one we're going to try and talk about today, which are gamma waves. If delta waves are the lowest and slowest brain waves, gamma waves are the ones at the opposite end. So those are the fastest waves you produce in your brain. They can be hard to measure accurately because they're fast, but you tend to produce them when you're focused and engaged in problem solving, or sometimes when you're involved in autobiographical or self-reflective thinking. So, without getting into the weeds about how we measure all of them, I'll say that EEG can pick up all of these signals, can measure them, and can tell us how they interact with each other. So you can imagine if you're awake, you've got more beta waves. If you're in a deep sleep, we see more delta waves.
And this would be why they would use it at a sleep lab. They can tell when you're asleep. Precisely, yeah.
Exactly. And we've got really good time resolution when we're doing EEG measurements. So they're not always good at telling you what part of the brain something is happening in, but really good at telling you when it's happening.
So what did we see with these various waves, or one in particular, in regards to this gentleman's neural activity?
Generally speaking, the biggest surprise, and the thing the authors underscore, is that for a brief period, even after the heart stopped pumping blood into the brain oscillations that they were measuring kept going. So there were brain patterns that they could still measure even after the heart had stopped. That in itself was notable. Second, though, was the pattern of waves that they noticed, and they thought those were interesting also. So they noticed a surge in this gamma band activity. The one I said was related to really intense higher cognitive functions or to self reflection. And they noticed a decrease in some of the alpha activity. So there was a suggestion that something was changing, and they didn't expect to see a pattern like that.
How does this particular finding relate to this notion of seeing your life pass before your eyes then? It seems like it could be activating the right parts of your brain associated with memory. Can we know that, or can we think that might be the case?
I mean, we definitely could say it's possible. In a healthy person with a healthy brain, we do see a similar pattern of cross coupling between alpha and gamma activities. And that pattern is related to things like memory and recall. So, in healthy people, there's a pattern kind of like this that could be thinking about your own past. Now, that said, there's a really big but. There's a couple. So, of course, this gentleman's not able to tell us whether he experienced that or not, obviously. Additionally, traumatic brain injuries can affect brainwaves. So, the fact that this fellow fell and hit his head is pretty relevant here. We don't know if he had typical brainwaves. And additionally, another thing that can affect patterns of brainwaves and how different bands like alpha and gamma work together is anticonvulsant medications, which is exactly what they give you if you start having seizures. So this fellow experienced a head injury that caused a problem and then was given medications to treat the problem. Both of those things do tend to mess up your brainwaves. So he was not a typical healthy person like we're talking about.
And as you've already mentioned it, which I think is a good point to underscore, it's a difficult study to kind of do again because, of course, to find a healthy person to do it on right before they die is, well, I mean, those two things are in kind of direct contradiction.
Right.
What do you make as a scientist? And this is something we certainly run into with the paranormal a lot, with kind of the anecdotal, in this case, combining a little bit with the scientific. How does the many, many reports of near-death experiences, which do line up with kind of memory activation, as a scientist, do you find that compelling at all? Or are you more just on the side that, well, like we can't tell exactly what they're thinking and feeling at that moment? Because it does seem at least intriguing to me.
Absolutely. I think one thing that's interesting to me that kind of hasn't come up in much of the media coverage, but does get discussed in the paper from Frontiers, is that there's a study that was done with rats in 2013. And the rats who scientists were able to study as they moved from life to death showed a very similar pattern of brain activity. They showed these bursts of activity, some of them in this gamma range. So whether or not the rats' lives were flashing before their eyes, what that does suggest is that there's something going on in mammal brains that might be a biological response to death or might be the process of dying. And if there is a signature like that, then it's certainly possible that we could keep looking for it and we could explore.
I think that leads nicely into my next question, which is kind of about evolution. From my understanding of the case, the patient was not conscious at the moment of death, which would mean the brain activity was not the patient trying to remember something or a train of thought that led from one memory to the next, but rather a spontaneous, unconscious act of the brain itself, like turning on a TV in a dark room, or a TV, more specifically, turning on itself in a dark room. It seems to be kind of built into the hardware of the brain. So why do you think our brains would do this? And I guess that's the part I find a little eerie. From an evolutionary perspective, how would this trait ever come to be? It doesn't seem to provide a means to elongate life or be beneficial in the survival or propagation of the species. It seems like if it is a moment of reflection and seeing kind of the highlights for your life, that feels like a moment of extreme grace in the last throes of our mortal life. Is there an evolutionary reason why this might occur, if it is that?
Jim, there's a lot in that question. I think there are scientists who are firmly in the camp that every experience can be attributed to some kind of electrical firing in your brain, and every perception can be accounted for. And then I think also there are some recorded cases of people who held those views having near death experiences themselves and completely changing their understanding of how this must work, sort of being converted to the powerfulness of these close to God end of life experiences. So I don't know that I can pick a side. I think you're right that there's something universal about the descriptions people give us of these near-death experiences. Often it's when your heart stops beating. In hospitals, we call that coding. And when people code, for example, reduced blood flow is one thing that happens. Well, one of the consequences of reduced blood flow is loss of vision. So if your eyes stop giving input, your brain will sometimes start creating visual stimulation for you in the absence of input from your eyes. So there's all kinds of weird things going on in the brain. I think you touched on a really tricky part of this, which is that we can't set up circumstances to measure things like dying very easily or ethically in any consistent way. So it's hard for us to measure. And for people who worship at the altar of quantifiable data, it keeps them really skeptical because they can't measure. But absolutely, it's really interesting that these sort of brain power outages that are associated with things like cardiac arrest have really consistent experiences for people. I don't know if we can account for them. I will say I'm fascinated by the literature on astronauts and other people who kind of expect to lose consciousness. Their descriptions map onto near-death experiences. They're sort of near-death experiences light. So they also have tunnel vision. They see bright lights. They feel like they woke up. There's something here. We just haven't figured out how to study it yet. Because studying brains, man, it's a wild ride. It's an emerging field.
It sounds like fun for you, getting in there and trying to figure these things out.
Yeah.
Perhaps a final question about the study itself. Should this change the way we think about death? With patients' intense brain activity continuing, it was 30 seconds or so after the heart had stopped beating, cardiac arrest, which is usually the standard indicator, as I understand it.
Yeah.
If someone can still dream or remember after the heart has stopped, do we need to change our definition of when someone dies? Or if you want to get really philosophical, do you even need a heart beating to be considered alive?
Ooh. Well, I would caution you that being able to measure electrical activity isn't the same as dreaming or remembering. So people who are at the end of life might be showing electrical activity that isn't associated with remembering or dreaming. I'd sort of point you to the whole concept of a chicken with its head cut off. It can have no head and it can still run around for a little while because you can get muscle firing in the absence of, an intact central nervous system. So we can tease all these things apart.
If you were the author of this particular study, how can this be pursued further? We've talked about the tricky ethical considerations that are involved. Do any things quickly come to mind of other things you'd be interested to see, at least?
One thing that comes to mind is that in chatting with a friend of mine who is a neuroscientist in a hospital, she pointed out that people can have their life flash before their eyes when they're not having a near death or a death experience. And I wonder if there's a way to get at some of these questions without knocking on death's door. So maybe there's a way, for example, having your life flash before your eyes is an experience people report when they fall from great heights. Now, I'm not advocating pushing people, but I wonder if there's a way to explore this phenomenon and having these autobiographical memories. Maybe they're involuntary. Maybe there's other ways we can measure them that keep us a little further away from questions of life and death.
I find the brain and our perception of reality, just the nuts and bolts working of our brain. Such a fascinating thing because really it's everything we are, we see, we ever will be, dream. I mean, it's everything to us individually. I'm just curious, before we let you go, is there any other studies that you find particularly interesting about the brain that you'd want to share with us?
Oh, Jim, thank you for that slow pitch. I appreciate it. I have a favorite study that I like to share in trying to talk to folks about why we have to be a little bit careful in interpreting brain data. Because brain studies are really fascinating, they grab people's attention, and it seems like if you measured a brain, it has to be real. But there's always a little more going on because the technology is so complex. And I mentioned earlier in the episode that EEG is pretty portable, it's quiet, it's inexpensive comparatively, it's non invasive. And I contrasted that with MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. So if you've, like I have, blown out a knee, you might have had an MRI. You can have MRIs on all body parts, but also on your brain. And the MRIs are sort of the opposite of EEGs. They're big, they're heavy, they're loud, they're expensive. And they're also a way for us to study the brain. So, getting to the point, there's a study that made a big splash when I was a graduate student over a decade ago now. It's called Neural Correlates of Interspecies Perspective Taking in the Postmortem Atlantic Salmon, an Argument for Proper Multiple Comparisons Correction, published in the Journal of Serendipitous and Unexpected Results.
You scientists sure like your titles, don't you?
Yeah. Oh, we do. Everything has a colon. It's always got two parts. There has to be at least a $5 word in both halves. So this one was a real winner. It was scientists looking to study social perception of humans. But one of the things you have to do with really expensive pieces of complicated equipment is make sure they're calibrated right. So there's a couple of ways you can calibrate this. Sometimes it's just with a balloon filled with oil, but they did some other stuff, partly for fun. They took images of a pumpkin, and then they decided they weren't getting enough contrast. And they thought, we need something that's got some texture to it. And that's when I introduce you to the zombie salmon. So they just wandered into a grocery store and purchased a salmon for science and ran it through the machine. Now, if you buy a fish from the grocery store, you're pretty safe to assume it is dead. Or if it wasn't, it is when you get it to the MRI machine. They ran it through the machine. They showed it images of people in social situations that were, inclusive or exclusive, like they were going to do to the humans. They asked it how it was feeling. As far as I know, it didn't do anything. And then they put the data away. And a few years later, one of these scientists wanted to work with some students to teach them how to analyze data properly. And when they analyzed the data improperly, they found that the fish had a whole bunch of activation in its brain, as though it were responding to the pictures that they had shown it in the original experiment. So it would be great if the zombie fish had thoughts about like whether the people were being mean to each other in the study. What actually happened was that in analyzing what was happening, scientists look at voxels, which are teeny tiny brain areas, and they're a lot like pixels on a TV. So you can make like a million comparisons to figure out what's going on in a brain study. And some of them, just by random chance, will come out fine unless you analyze it well. They didn't. The salmon showed brain activity and they published the paper. Now, at first it was a joke, but actually the authors point out that since they published it, about half of scientists were doing this kind of sloppy analysis before they published their fish paper, and now about 10% of scientists are doing those sloppy analyses. So that's a really long story about a zombie fish to say that, sometimes dead fish have feelings about things if you don't do your science well, and also publishing those results, we hope, improved how people do brain science.
That's really interesting. Now, an obvious follow-up question is, they didn't eat the zombie fish, did they? That seems like it would be really bad luck or something.
As I understand it, they figured they shouldn't let it go to waste. And once they calibrated the machine, they ate it. This comes up because they couldn't file for reimbursement afterwards.
Of course.
Yeah.
Dr. Kate Einarson, thank you so much for being with us today to talk about the brain and this study. It's been a really interesting conversation and appreciate your insights. And I'm hoping we can reach out to you again if we have any brain questions in the future.
Jim, it was my pleasure. Even though I work in a hospital, I don't get to talk about this stuff very much. So thanks for having me. I hope to chat with you again in the future.
Thanks to Dr. Kate Einarson for, shall I say it, a mind-blowing conversation. Not all scientists are willing to come on a podcast that deals with the paranormal. So much love and respect to those that do. For information about our virtual haunted campfires or our in-person ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, so you're the first to learn of breaking Haunted Walk news. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.